part of the discovery, and that's what you guys do best. But there is also a big white space in terms of how AI and machine learning and data science could be potentially applied to sort of clinical care. And sort of, I use that term extremely broadly, and you'll see what I mean. Every aspect of how a health system functions, from operations to finances to actually improving patient outcomes. And I'll talk about that in a bit, right? So broadly, and everyone seeing my screen okay? Great. I'm going to sort of structure this talk into three parts. The first, I'm going to give you a brief history of AI, just from like the perspective of how things have evolved, and like it's interesting that AI has entered the public lexicon and the public imagination maybe 2 or 3 years back, but there's a long history going back. A lot of it at your institution as well, and it's important to sort of understand where we're coming from if you want to understand where we're going. And then I'll talk about some examples of AI applications, and then I'll spend a fair amount of time talking about challenges and opportunities. So AI has been around for a while, right? If you were dropped on Earth in 2022, you could be forgiven for thinking that AI was invented when ChatGPT made its chatbot public. But that's just not true, right? It was in 1956 that John McCarthy actually coined the term AI. And in 2000, that the pioneers of modern AI, Yann LeCun, Yoshua Bengio, and Geoff Hinton worked out the fundamentals of modern deep learning. And then finally, it was not too far after that, in 2017, when there was a first FDA-approved cloud-based deep learning application in healthcare. And since then, AI has just expanded tremendously. But it's also important, behooves us to remember the 70s and 90s when when there was a period in which hype was so high that the technology didn't really meet that hype, and as a result of that, public interest, government funding, uh, private funding for AI was at an all-time low, and that period was called as the AI winter. And I mentioned this only because hype is important because it excites people and makes easier to get things going. But at the same time, if technology doesn't live up to the hype, there are sort of adverse consequences of that. But why are we talking specifically so much about AI right now, right? So that's, in my mind, that's three major reasons. The first reason is the increasing amount of digitization of data that is happening in this world, right? Just think about your own lives. When you get up in the morning to go to bed, how much uh, time you spend interacting with sort of with your digital devices, be it your phone, your computer, your tablet, your wearables, etc., etc., and how much data do you generate as a result of that. The second is advances in computing, which is uh, uh, the reason NVIDIA is like the most valuable company in the world right now. Just aside, AI computing chips were never meant for AI; they were meant for playing games, and that's why they're called as graphical processing units. And then finally, sort of ChatGPT entering the public imagination, right? It took Google Translate 78 months to hit like 100 million users. It took ChatGPT 2 months. And healthcare, I would argue, is a field where data generation is uh, exponential. I think it's like the second most industry that generates data after finance. For example, in 2020, healthcare generated close to 2,500 exabytes of data, which is equivalent to 3 million years of IMAX quality video, which feels like watching Frozen multiple times since I have a 5-year-old daughter. And thanks to at Mount Sinai, we have a platform called as AI Ready Mount Sinai, or AIRMS, which has basically uh, generated and collated all of this healthcare information into one platform for all of our machine learning endeavors. And I would like to acknowledge Patricia Kovach, who's our Dean of Scientific Computing and Data, for her leadership in making this happen. And then the second reason is transformers, right? The T in ChatGPT. So there's a lot of people think that the architecture behind ChatGPT was invented by OpenAI. It was actually invented by Google or Google DeepMind at that point of time with this seminal paper called Attention is All You Need, which was, I think, the most influential papers of the last 50 years at least, because it is the foundation of all of the modern GPT systems. It's also takes the title for the best, it takes the prize for the best title, Attention is All You Need, which is what my wife says to me on a daily basis. So I think it's important to sort of understand what is attention, right? So if you think about a single word like bark, depending upon the context of the sentence in which it appears, the word bark means different things, right? For example, the sentence on the left means is where the bark is referring to a tree because it's coexisting with words like tree and brown. And on the right, it's referring to a dog because it's referring to like animal sounds like loud, right? So if you just take a word like bark, if it coexists more with uh, leaves and flowers and twigs, you would assume that because of the context, bark means a bark of a tree. But if it coexists with more words like animal sounds, and I'm not going to say them, it means that it refers to a dog's bark, and that is what attention is, right? Attention is basically the mathematical relationship of every word, the statistical probability of every word in the English language compared to the words that coexist around it, right? And that is how um, uh, 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 transformers are trained. Transformers are trained on massive, massive amounts of text, trillions of words, all of the words in the English language, all of the words in the internet. So they can basically understand the relationship of each word in the context that it appears with every other word. And that is what attention is. Attention basically is just the mathematical relationship of every single word in the English language compared to every other word in the English language and how it co-occurs. And that is what a GPT is, right? It's a transformer because the transformer is the architecture using attention. It's pre-trained because it's pre-trained with with trillions and trillions of words, right? Words. So it's given the statistical distribution of the words in the vast corpus of mostly English language, what words usually follow the sequence. If you know, because it's been pre-trained on trillions of words, it would say that the first person to walk on the moon was Neil Armstrong. And it's generative because it generates statistically likely sequences of words, or words are called tokens in this case. And they don't really understand text meaning in a literal sense, they just understand the statistics and the mathematical model behind it, right? And that's how a transformer looks. You input into it, it goes through this multi-head attention process and then it generates the next sequence of statistically likely words with the output shifted right. And that has led to the concept of foundation models, right? So I've been working on ML for the last 15 years, right? And I still remember the days of traditional machine learning, right? So if you had a specific task or a specific thing that you needed to do, you had to go get data for that particular task, train one model, and then it performed well for that particular task. And then if you needed a second task, you went out and got the data, trained a model, performed well on that task, and rinse and repeat. And as a result of that, it was, that led to a lot of individual siloed models that required task-specific training and lots of human supervision in deciding what the parameters would be, what the hyperparameters would be, etc. But now that has given way to foundation models, which are pre-trained on massive external data, be it text, be it images, be it videos, be it music, etc., etc. And then it's adaptable by prompting. Anytime you use ChatGPT, you put a prompt in, and you don't need a separate model for answering a question and answer or translation or making a poem or making an essay, right? And in case you want to like fine tune it to your particular enterprise, you just fine tune it with this massive foundation model, and that can improve sort of performance on specialized tasks. So there is a shift happening in AI from traditional ML, where there are individual siloed models, to a massive multitasking model. Models that require task-specific training to models that can do multiple tasks with little or no training or fine-tuning. And there's a lot of human supervised training at the start, making choices about parameters and hyperparameters, but this has led to multiple unsupervised training approaches. And I would argue that this is ideal for healthcare because health and human beings are a complex system that exists within multiple systems of its own, right? Like, human health and disease has multiple layers, starting from genomics and omics, obviously, but going to social and behavioral, environmental, how you feel, what you put in your body, how you interact with everyone else. And this has to be sort of put in context of all of your medical history, but also sort of the world's medical literature continuously updated. And I would argue that this is a time for a foundation model of human health, where you can have multimodal self-supervised training on all of the text in the electronic health records, and combine it with different sort of orthogonal data types, including images and electronic health records, omics, and then you can link that to the world's literature, all of the recent publications, and knowledge graphs, in order to provide you sort of with the best thing to do in any particular situation. And that is sort of the promise of AI in my mind in health, right? Because AI knowledge is this massive knowledge, embedded knowledge engine, which can take raw data and be whatever the data that might be, in prompts or tabular data or imaging, and convert that into of any output that you want, right? You want to make a better diagnosis. Do you want to predict who's going to get a disease in the next year? You can summarize a whole medical history in like a page. You can generate clinical decision support, right? And I think that this is one of the big promises of AI in health systems in my mind, because right now, if anyone practices medicine, you know how much time we spend, being sort of data entry clerks or data entry monkeys, where when we talk to a patient for 3 minutes and then spend the rest 12 minutes typing out a note and putting in orders, right? So I think that is the promise of AI in healthcare, is sort of flipping that paradigm. Instead of making providers and clinicians and work for data, it's actually making data work for patients and for physicians and for health systems by automating and augmenting a lot of data and information processing tasks. In my mind, AI is an arbitrage of knowledge for time, right? Because it can do a lot of the automated and augmentation of information processing tasks. It can give back providers time in the day that they had to, go home and put in notes, right? Or it could give back providers time in a day to actually talk to patients and be more present and be a better physician. But it also gives you time, because it can predict stuff early in order to make valuable decisions that can actually impact outcomes. And that leads to a true learning health system, right? So in this slide, we are looking at the concept of a learning health system, and this is not defined by the Agency of Healthcare Research and Quality. A learning health system brings together data and research and clinical care to continuously improve patient outcomes. It works by leveraging data from everyday patient care, mostly from electronic health record, but can be from any other source, including wearables or at-home devices, analyzing it to generate insights, testing those insights rapidly, in the form of randomized trials or A/B testing, in order to generate high-grade evidence, and feeding that evidence back into the system to improve clinical practice and outcomes. And that clinical practice actually generates data on to how the practice is doing, and you use that to generate evidence and feed that back into practice, right? So it continually goes on from data to evidence and to practice. And I want to make the argument that learning health systems or smart health systems are not actually a nice to have in today's challenging world. It's an imperative because medicine and medical practice is fast evolving, and personalized care using all of the data that we have at our disposal is a key to better outcomes. And AI, I would argue, has the potential to accelerate every step of this learning process, from generation of data to transferring data into evidence, and from using evidence to inform practice, and so on and so forth to improve care and outcomes. Now, in the second part of my talk, I'd like to give a few examples of AI applications. And if you think about like the functions of a health system, right, you think about it broadly in three categories. You think about clinical, right? What can you do to improve clinical outcomes and decrease bad outcomes from happening and improve and increase the probability of good outcomes happening. You can think about how you can use AI to actually augment the process of research itself. And then you have to think about people, right? How to empower people in order to make sure that they are operating at the top of whatever they are doing. So I'm going to give you examples in each of these three categories. So first, talking about clinical, Mount Sinai Health System, I think, was one of the first health systems in order to invest heavily in its own AI team in order to build products that could be deployed across the health system. So Mount Sinai Health System, for those of you who are unfamiliar, is one of the largest health systems in New York City. It has 6 hospitals across the boroughs. We see approximately 2 million patients a year. And now, because the AI team, we have 15 products that are deployed across the health system, making around 10 million predictions a year. And this is thanks to David Rich, who's the Chief Clinical Officer, Robbie Freeman, who's the Chief Digital Transformation Officer, and Matt and Prem and Arash. And these are all of the algorithms that have been deployed, that have been developed internally, tested, and then deployed. Things starting from like which patients are malnourished, to which patients are at risk of falls, which patients are at risk of delirium, which patients are at risk of clinical deterioration, to things that we deployed during COVID, to behavioral health and pressure injuries. But I'm going to give you 2 specific examples that I worked on now that are deployed in the clinical care, which how this impacts clinical care directly, right? So the first example I'm going to give you is when traditional methods are not enough, right? So this is an actual case that spurred the development of this product at Mount Sinai. So we have a big neonatal care unit, and in the neonatal care unit, a newborn suffered a spinal cord bleed. And the bleed caused a subtle decrease in leg movement that was too subtle to detect early by humans. Like this was the slight, this is an actual case. This was the bleed that led to this slight movement. And I mean, if you look at and think about a NICU, it's not possible to watch everyone 24/7. Humans can't do that. And if this bleed was caught earlier, things could have changed. But because it was caught later, there was the neonate required neurosurgery and care, but had permanent paralysis. The question was, could AI have detected these changes sooner and changed this baby's future? And that was when the idea came for video-powered neuromonitoring in the NICU, right? Because neurological injury is devastating, but it cannot be predicted currently in time. And if you think about video AI, anyone who's driven a like a Rivian or a Tesla, you know how video AI has revolutionized self-driving cars. And we have this, we developed and validated an video AI to predict neurological injuries in babies from video data. So you can actually detect these subtle changes on the video AI monitor by segmentation and by pose mapping. It's called pose AI, and it detects monitors continuously to predict neurological injury much earlier than humans for early treatment. This was published in Lancet eBiomedicine last year. It has got an FDA breakthrough status right now. It works really well on held out data set. The AUC is almost like 90%. And more importantly, it can detect a neurological injury approximately an hour and a half before humans can detect it. So this is the example of, again, leveraging AI for knowledge for time, right? Because you can have a simple, we have a simple camera that's put in every crib that can actually monitor infants 24/7 and give warning signals for if there is neurological injury detected. And the vision for this, is AI in every NICU incubator. We are currently, this is deployed within a few ICU beds at Mount Sinai, but we are deploying in a prospective clinical trial across the NICU net. And we want to deploy this computer vision at every NICU incubator in the country. This was actually developed by Ben Glicksberg, who leads our new Center of Child Health AI, Felix Richter, whose patient it was, and was inspired to build this technology based upon a clinical case that we saw. And then Bruce Gelb, who is the Dean of Child Health Research at Mount Sinai. And now it's being deployed across these various places through the NICU net. The second example I want to give is work that I've done on electrocardiograms, right? So this is an ECG. Many of you have seen it. It's it measures the electrical activity of the heart. It's an inexpensive, non-invasive, no-risk modality. It's incorporated into wearables right now. If any of your Apple Watch or a Fitbit or a Whoop, it can monitor your ECGs. But the thing is, we don't use this information extremely well because there's a lot of information that's not visible to the naked eye, which is hidden in this waveform, right? And usually when you use ECGs, you do two things, right? You need an expert cardiologist who can actually look at the ECG and see any obvious issues, or you sort of reduce it down to a bunch of numbers like PR interval, et cetera, and you use that in your modeling approaches. But I'm going to make the argument today that there's a lot of information in the ECG which is hidden in the waveform, not visible to the naked eye, that can be leveraged for AI purposes. So heart failure is a big, big issue in the United States, right? And this is preaching to the choir sometimes, but like around 6.2 million adults in the US have heart failure, over 500,000 deaths every year, yearly cost of more than 31 billion. And one of the major problems with heart failure is actually underdiagnosis or misdiagnosis. And the misdiagnosis is high depending upon where you are, right? It's even in hospital settings with access to the best care possible, misdiagnosis rates are around 16%. And if you are in a community with access to less care, it can go up to 70%. So on an average, 30% of individuals who have heart failure don't know that they have heart failure and are not appropriately treated. And that's like a big missed opportunity because now there are extremely good medications with goal-directed medical therapy that can prevent worsening of heart failure and in some cases actually reverse it. So that's why we use an ECG algorithm to quantify heart function accurately from raw electrocardiogram signals. So we trained this algorithm on 150,000 patients that had a matched echo, leading to three-fourths of a million echo ECG pairs. And we ran this through a neural network to classify both right as well as left heart failure. And it performed really well. Now, this just got FDA approval yesterday. So it's being used at Mount Sinai. I'll show you how it's being used at Mount Sinai. But it worked really well in terms of AUROC with an AUROC of 95%. But you can also actually quantify the level of heart function using a regression model, and it quantifies to a mean error of around 6%. It can also do a right ventricular systolic dysfunction very, very easily with an AUROC of 85%. But more importantly, it performs the same across different ages, different genders, and different races and ethnicities on external validation. So this is a sun plot showing the different ages and the performance of the algorithm across different ages, and it performs the same for different genders. And across different ethnicities, it performs exactly the same. So arguably, it's an unbiased way of detecting and diagnosing heart failure, because otherwise, the ways of detecting heart failure are dependent upon access of care and where you live. But here's one more interesting thing, right? The incorrect classifications may pick up hidden signals. And what do I mean by that, right? So we classified true positives as where the AI ECG said that it was a positive heart failure, and the echo said the same thing. And we classified false positives as when the AI ECG said that there was heart failure, the echo said there was no heart failure, and true negatives as when both were negative. But if you follow these people over 5 years, starting from the same point, people who had quote unquote false positive on the AI ECG had a much higher incidence of low LVEF, which is the left ventricular ejection fraction, as compared to people who had true negatives, right? So, it's interesting because then it says that the AI algorithm is actually picking up hidden signal in the electrocardiogram, which needs to be sort of monitored over time, because these individuals have a much higher propensity of developing heart failure in the future. But how does it actually work in clinical practice, right? So this is a dashboard that we created for ECG prediction, currently under research license only, but now I think it can be on the clinical license because we got like FDA approval for this. So you can, each and every Mount Sinai person has access to this. So you can just like put in the MRN of your patient, and it'll pull up all of the ECGs from your patient. And you can just click on a particular ECG and it'll tell you whether the patient has a risk of high heart failure versus not. There's a bunch of models that I didn't get to discuss in terms of aortic stenosis or COPD or etc. But we add models all the time depending upon whether they're validated or not. And you can actually it in a few seconds tells you the risk of heart failure. So this is a extremely cost-effective way of triaging and diagnosing people who have who have a variety of cardiovascular conditions with no additional money required. So I'm going to now speak about a little bit about how AI can be used to augment research, not AI research itself, but AI to augment research, right? So if you think about clinical research itself, uh, it involves a lot of paperwork, right? This is from a recent review that I read. If you think about the whole life cycle of clinical research, starting from study design to setup to trial to supply chain management to analysis and submission, there's a lot of paperwork required, right? Through all this process. And AI, particularly generative AI, actually can be very, very useful in decreasing the effort and automating several of these tasks. So I'm going to show you an example, right? So we have this recruitment pipeline. So clinical trials are a big source of revenue for the system and are important because they provide therapeutic opportunities. But a lot of clinical trials fail because A, you don't get enough patients. B, screening patients is a manually and time-intensive task because all of the inclusion and exclusion criteria are actually present within notes. And you need a physician or a person to read the notes, right? So, we developed this clinical trials recruitment pipeline, which integrates the EHR to scan patient data, uses LLMs for potential eligibility, and generates a rank list for coordinator review. This is how it works. And we deployed it for IBD, inflammatory bowel disease, and we retrieved candidates missed by manual screening. And the enrollment in 2 months went from 0 to 12 for this particular NCT trial, and from 1 to 5 for this trial. And this work was done with Eyal, who's the chief of generative AI, Monica Kraft, who's the chair of our department of medicine, and Amelia, who heads up the clinical trial institute. Now, talking briefly about people, right? A lot of frontline healthcare workers are burnt out. I mean, because there's a lot of administrative burden, right? And one of the areas where I think AI can help is AI scribes or ambient AI for documentation. And Lisa Stump, who's a chief digital and information officer, has been instrumental in pushing ambient AI throughout our health system. And this is sort of early insights on ambient sky adoption, where there's a positive impact on burnout, a positive impact on quality load, cognitive load, a positive impact on patient experience. If you think about it, like because a physician is talking to them and not like spending half of the time like typing on a screen, and improved clinical note summary, which actually leads to better billing opportunities. So I think this is one of the areas where incentives are aligned, where patients, physicians, and uh, health systems can all be aligned behind this. And the second administrative burden that we can think about is coding, right? I mean, like, people went to medical school not to see patients and to improve outcomes, and to not learn how to be good coders to improve the bottom line. But AI is actually great at coding, right? This is work that we did to see what the accuracy of so we had a bunch of emergency room notes, and then we had humans code them, and then we had a GPT-4 code them. And we looked at whether the GPT wins, humans win, or whether they equal. In the vast majority of cases, the uh, LLM performed much better than humans in actually coding, regardless of whether they were attendings or they were residents, so regardless of seniority. Same thing for whether it was specificity, because this is important to the bottom line, whether the coding specificity was better by LLMs versus humans, and the specificity of coding was still much better by LLMs, regardless of seniority level. So I think that, there's a win here, because it frees up time from uh, doing this repetitive low value tasks, but also frees up time to actually focus on being a good physician and not coding. And the other thing is like uh, registry building, right? So we have this ML classifier to identify complications of a surgery. It was a QI metric because every hospital in the country has to like go through all of the operative reports and all of the patient charts to see whether patients, whether um, um, uh, patients had any complications when they were to report it centrally for others. So, before we did this, residents actually had to take a bunch of time to go through the notes, to read them, and to extract coding. And, it was a waste of time, right? When LLMs could do it well. And, we identified 2x more complications as opposed to AI, with low percentage of false negatives. And most importantly, it took LLM like 5 minutes to do for all of the notes, as opposed to the hours and hours of time it would have taken residents. And we had this reports manually looked at by physicians, and there was a high satisfaction rate. All right, so now I've talked about sort of the applications, and I think I'm going to talk about the challenges and opportunities thereof, right? So there is a big healthcare AI paradox right now, right? And it's the leaky problem, the leaky pipeline problem. So, as an ML scientist or a researcher, you want to develop a model. And, I hope that the ultimate goal would be to use this model to improve some aspect of life, right? Improve patient outcomes, improve processes, improve something, right? So you develop a model, but then you realize that this model is not fit for purpose, because you developed on the wrong patient population. There's predictors that are not available. It's very time intensive to use the model. The outcome is not measured reliably. Okay, so some models fall out here. Then on the next step, you realize that there's really no validation, right? Why would you pursue validation? It's incompletely reported, it's not transparent, it's overfitted, it's proprietary, so you can't really validate it. Suppose you get through the step of validation, then it's not going to be implemented, right? Because no one asked for it. It has no impact on any decision making or patient outcomes. It's cost effective to use. It's not cost effective to use. It's cumbersome to use. People don't know how to use the model. It doesn't fit into their workflow. And even if you get implemented and you get in front of clinicians, it's not adopted because people are like, it's not useful. We didn't, we are not trusting the predictions. It's not transparent enough, and it's outdated, and it's not a problem that we asked. So there is this leaky pipeline problem in academic medicine where we have a lot of talent on the academic side of things, but very little of it gets adopted and deployed into clinical care. And the other problem is industry doesn't really care about this, right? There's a bunch, as a chief AI officer, I get a call from industry saying that, we have this model that cures everything. Please use it. And when I ask them, what's your evidence behind this model? They show me a really nice PowerPoint slide. So there is a problem right now that there is a huge amount of work being done into researching AI models that never get implemented or adopted into clinical care, while the vast majority of models that are implemented into care in the health system and the clinical side of things are never researched. And that is a major problem, right? Because you might have heard of this, and this is work done by Karandeep, who's the chief AI officer now at UC San Diego, where Epic had this AI algorithm for sepsis that they just deployed in a bunch of hospitals throughout the country. And then when someone did a proper evaluation of it, it was found to be an accuracy of 50%. So 50%, it's just coin flip. And it was used to generate millions of predictions, and God only knows how many people were affected by this model, because there is no concept of testing these models as you would do other things, right? Like uh, I think this is a paper that came out 2 years back, hasn't changed much since, but the number of trials done every year around AI have been around 15, as opposed to the hundreds of trials done for drugs. And so again, what we research, we don't implement and adopt. What we implement, we don't research. So how do you fix this, right? You sort of think about start with the why. And Nick Gavin, who's the Chief Clinical Innovation Officer, is sort of my partner on this. I think the important thing is to identify tractable problems that are amenable to intervention by talking to providers who are on the front line, asking them, what problem do you want us to solve? Making sure that it aligned with institutional goals after doing an opportunity analysis. And this opportunity analysis just doesn't have to be financial. It can be, doing the right thing. It can be like throughput. It can be improving sort of patient experience, right? And then only you think about developing the model, because if you identify a tractable problem, you can develop a fit for purpose model on the patient population where it would be implemented. Then you test the approach using either a silent pilot for safety or workflow analysis for efficacy, and A/B or testing or RCT for effectiveness. But that problem doesn't stop, right? Because we have a problem in informatics called as set it and forget it, because you need to do continuous monitoring and evaluation. Both monitoring needs to be done around the technical aspects of data monitoring to make sure that data definitions haven't shifted, model definitions haven't shifted, etc., etc. And you need to do it around long-term evaluation to make sure that the model and the workflow is actually doing the things that you expect it to be doing. Otherwise, you're just burning electricity. The second major problem is that bias is pervasive in this in AI, and it's pervasive in AI because it's also pervasive in the world, right? The world has real world patterns of health inequality and discrimination, and that makes its way into discriminatory data, which leads to sort of discriminatory, biased AI design and deployment practices, and that finally leads to application injustices. And that application injustice again contributes to real world patterns of health inequality and discrimination, leading to discriminated data, leading to design, and then again leading to application injustices. And this unvirtuous cycle from hell continues. So to test bias in LLMs, we actually did a pretty simple study. And this was done by EAL. So we generated 500 clinical vignettes on the emergency room just using a prompt from Claude. And we supplemented them by 500 triage notes on the Mount Sinai Health System. Two board certified physicians validated all of the cases to make sure the cases made sense. And for each case, the LLM was basically asked 4 questions, right? What is the priority for this patient to triage him, high, medium, low? What further testing would you recommend? On the basis of further testing, we actually said whether the tests were appropriate versus not. What could be the treatment approach, invasive versus not? And does this patient need a mental health assessment? The only thing that we did was we changed the social demographics of it. So instead of the case remained the same, right? This is a case with like abdominal pain, remained exactly the same. We just changed the patient social demographics from straight to LGBTQ, or non-binary, from white to black, from high socioeconomic status to unhoused. Nothing else changed. The case remained the same. We just changed the social demographics. And the results were actually startling, right? For low-income patients, just because they were unhoused, it recommended less advanced testing, even when it was mandated. Like patient came in with chest pain, signs suggestive of a pulmonary embolism, didn't recommend a CT scan. For high-income patients, it actually recommended more advanced testing. For homeless patients, even though the case had nothing to do with mental health, recommended a mental health assessment and more hospital admissions. And if you look at sort of the social demographic group with a control patient being a white straight man, for example, a black transgender woman was approximately twice as likely to get a mental health assessment, even if the case had nothing to do with mental health assessment. The physician said that this patient should not have a mental health assessment. Same for invasiveness, right? Basically, like invasive therapies, which are not really recommended. If your patient was unhoused, they had approximately twice the invasiveness score of a control patient, right? And again, we had all of these validated according to medical guidelines and according to physicians. And physicians, so there was a benchmark of what you should do, and this far, far exceeded that. So disparities actually in this arose from biased associations in the training data, and there were large persistent differences which suggest that models overtly rely on demographic clues rather than actual clinical differences. And we are in the process, we are in a race now to implement models to look cooler. But if you think about what would happen if you implemented this in at point of triage in an EED, right? It would include resource misallocation. Why would any patient trust you after that? And like widen health gaps. So I won't go this into detail, but like we've developed like a paper is coming out soon where we have developed an AI guided strategy to characterize dataset bias. Dataset bias can be of various types, right? You can have underrepresentation bias, you can have complexity bias. So the approach that we call as equity can actually characterize dataset bias. It identified bias in healthcare resource allocation. There was a famous paper by Ziad Obermeyer, which actually showed that if you apply the same algorithm to blacks versus white, because it over-indexes on income rather than chronic condition, causes bias. So you could have identified this upfront. It can complement cross-disciplinary approaches because it can complement grassroots interventions, but it can also help you sort of curate the data set better to decrease the model biases and improve model retraining. And mitigates underdiagnosis bias in population. So I think this is obviously just one part of the equation, right? But you can actually now look at a data set and see if it's biased before developing a model on it. The second thing I want to talk about is hallucinations, right? And most of you know what hallucinations are. It's when things make, large language models make up stuff that have no basis in reality, right? Be it made up references or made up places or made up things, right? So we wanted to see how big of a problem this was with large language models and clinical decision support, right? So we again generated 300 cases, but in every case, we put in either a fabricated lab or a fabricated condition or a fabricated symptoms. And then we ran the cases again and again on the LLMs and had physicians verify it and saw whether the the uh, hallucinate the fabricated stuff just perpetuated in like the large language model make up stuff around that puppet. This none of these things exist. These are like completely made up. And we actually told a model like this is made up, don't perpetuate it. But the results are like staggering, right? Like most models, be it like DeepSeek or GPT, they hallucinated like 50% of the times, right? And despite saying that this sign or this condition is made up, don't perpetuate it. It decreased the hallucination rate from like 60% to 40%. I mean, sure, 20% reduction, but like still bullshit to slightly less bullshit. And I mean, this is going to be a major problem because think about in electronic health records, if something gets mistyped or miscued or the adversarial attack, right? You could just have a hallucinated treatment plan, a hallucinated follow-up plan, etc., etc. So adversarial hallucinations actually pose serious risks for clinical use, and prompt engineering slightly more effective than lowering the temperature, which is basically making it more non-deterministic. But even the best performing model hallucinated in 50% of the cases. And like this is again why safeguards and cross-checking AI outputs by humans is critical. Finally, I think lack of transparency is endemic in this field because of the fact that a lot of these models are coming from industry. Like this was, I think, paper from Broad, which actually showed that the number of publications and the highest percentage of the biggest models are all from industry. And if you look at the transparency, like basically the model recipe, it's most of the private models are extremely non-transparent. You don't know what the training data was used. You don't know what methods were used. You don't know what the usage policies, et cetera, et cetera. And finally, and this is a more pervasive problem, when success is failure, right? So this paper was published in Annals like 2 years back. So if you think about, everything goes well, you have a model adopted, and you change behavior and you change outcomes. But the next time you retrain the model, it's now associated the pattern that it saw with like a bad outcome with now a good outcome. So the outcomes have flipped, and that leads to a massive loss of specificity and sensitivity. For example, if you retrain a model after it works, like even a small proportion of the time, the models lost up to 40% specificity and it just doesn't work for that model. It works, it has ripple effects across all of the models that are connected to that particular condition. For example, if you decrease cardiovascular attacks, you are going to decrease mortality. So a mortality model is going to suffer because you have prevented a cardiovascular attack, and so on and so forth. And this is another issue why we should not set it and forget it, because we are not currently monitoring which people we are deploying these models on, which people it's firing on, what actions were taken. It's important to do that just for as post-market surveillance. So how do we think about tackling these challenges and these risks, right? I think we need regulation, which is a problem in this day and age. But at the local level, at the health system levels, we need governance, right? We need data-driven governance. We know what is deployed, when it is deployed, how does it work? What's the longitudinal monitoring plan? We need rigor at the implementation level and not just set it and forget it. And then we need transparency at all levels, right? And I'm just going to quickly mention the AI life cycle at Mount Sinai, where there's a pre-triage, there's multiple checkpoints, there's validation, there's deployment, but then there's quality assurance and monitoring. And model can be pulled at any of these checkpoints if it doesn't meet certain predefined criteria. So I think that every institution should do governance as it suits fit, and it's important for it. But like I think there should be some governance structure in place. And finally, I'd like to just say in my last minute is, right now machines haven't exceeded us as humans and providers, but suppose they do, right? In the next 10 years, we have artificial super intelligence. Are we sort of making sure that healthcare, which is a basic human right, is the health system is sort of actually, encoded by human values? And is it resilient enough for that? I don't think so, but I think we are at an inflection point, and I think we need to come together as a science and a medicine community to actually engender that. So with that, thank you. I'm happy to take any questions.
Great. Thank you so much for such a great talk. Any questions from the audience? Oh, go ahead, Arash.
Thank you, Dr. Nadkarni. This is incredibly insightful. I was just curious, you mentioned about some of the models that you already deployed at Mount Sinai. It looks like it's been across many different clinical services. I'm just wondering from your role, if you think about the clinical priorities of your health system, considering that you have a fairly unified platform for, data training, the governance, evaluation, what are the priorities in your health systems if you want to take on, some of the top big clinical problems, either operational or clinical? What do you think takes priority with the highest return on your investment?
Yeah, the highest priority right now are mostly operational problems, right? Like, for example, finding patients for missed opportunities for drug medications with 340B, or finding patients, preventing leakage of patients from primary care to specialty and back again. So those are the mostly sort of clinical and operational problems. The clinical problems also have to do not so much with improving patient outcomes, but also improving patient throughput to the emergency room and improving patient flow through the health system, et cetera, et cetera. And then there are obviously some other clinical problems, including, identification of optimal utilization of resources like ORs or endoscopy rooms.
Any other questions from the audience?
Yeah, I had a question. Great talk. Thank you so much. I had a question about the ECGI platform.
Sure.
I was wondering, has it actually changed the practice of your providers? There was a paper from the Mayo Clinic on their EF model that didn't really show a huge difference in the amount of echoes being ordered with access to their ECGAI heart failure model. And if it has changed practice, what kind of metrics have you used to assess benefit?
So it's currently being used by providers to identify patients for heart failure. So it improved echo identification by 40%. But I think that the platform is just one part of it, because there's a complete workflow that it goes into, because there's for heart failure, like one of the medications, or for one of the goals of goal-directed medical therapy is SGLT2 inhibitor. So there's a hospital-wide mandate to increase SGLT2 utilization because of economic reasons, but also because of the right thing to do. That went up by 40%. So there is a push. But again, like I said, that this is, if you just give it as a platform to providers and do nothing with it, nothing will happen. So you have to think about the workflow that it engenders.
Thanks.
I had a question actually about your leaky pipeline diagram, and in particular, the implementation gap. So as someone who did PhD, in AI, you see so many models, really interesting, well-behaving models, that then just go nowhere from the implementation side. So do you have any tips on how that can be addressed?
Yeah, figure out what problem you're trying to solve, right? Because if it's not a problem that the frontline providers think it's a problem, it will never be utilized.
It was never the concern. It was that the student would create a great model, would graduate, and then it goes nowhere. There's no person to pick it up. So do you have any tips there?
That's a very, we have a team that takes over after the graduates to actually push this through, and it has to again be aligned with operational and institutional priorities, right? So that's institution specific thing. So you have to make sure that a lot of this continuity of work.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Any other questions from the group?
Yeah, I've got a question. I was particularly interested in the monitoring in the the neurological monitoring project that you did. I could read the paper, but I thought it would be easier to ask you. So how was the model trained? Was it done in a supervised fashion? Did somebody actually label what is going on with this particular
So they
movement,
labeled
what
it
it relates to?
in a very few number of cases, but then used like, those small number of cases to extrapolate to the much larger number of cases and then trained on those. So it was partly labeling, but also a lot of it was then self-supervised learning.
Mm-hmm. Did you correlate the physical examination findings with like radiological or findings, nerve
So we
conduction
correlated with
studies?
EEG findings.
Right.
So because
Okay.
the only way you can, I mean, it's not a perfect gold standard just because
Yeah.
measurement issues and like positioning and stuff, but like it's still the EEG thing is like 95% well, I don't know exactly how accurate it is because that was actually used as the gold standard. I don't actually believe that's a gold standard, but that's a separate story. But we correlated it with EEG findings because radiology is already, very post hoc, right? Because, if there's a bleed and stuff, it'll only show up after the bleed has become large enough for this the radiology. And it's also really hard to take neonates for radiology. So that's why there's continuous EEG monitoring.
Yeah. Sorry, if I may, I just wanted to ask your perspective on the availability of data for AI in healthcare. I work in the field of digital speech as biomarkers, and pathological speech data sets are just so limited. So what strategies do you have with, just as a general question, in AI for healthcare when there's limited amounts of data that you can get, especially primary data? What strategies do you employ in that situation?
I mean, that's a longer question, right? I think healthcare institutions should come together in order to like develop federated approaches where you can train on individual data silos for like, and I'm not using silos in a pejorative sense, but silos to create sort of more generalizable models, right? But there are newer approaches on data augmentation and synthetic data that work reasonably well. We haven't talked about those, but they work reasonably well. But I think broadly, right, I think the question is, why are you doing this, right? If you want a generalizable model, then you should do it on multiple data sets throughout the health system, throughout various health system, be it federated or not. But if you want a model that just works for Sinai or Harvard or whatever, you should make sure that it works for Sinai or Harvard or whatever. And in that case, generalizability might not be a concern at all.
Great, thank you. That was a fantastic talk. So this was actually the last seminar we have for the spring. We're going to take a summer break. So we'll likely take July and August off and then have another talk in September. And so in the chat, I am popping up our speaker suggestion form. We have a list of tentative speakers, but if there's someone you would like to have come, please fill out the form and we will see if we can get them here. So thank you again, Dr. Nadkarni, and see you all again in September.
Thank you.
Thanks.